Good morning, class 10. So we have completed chapter 8, that was waste, the 5 broad topics that were there. Yesterday, I sent you the notes on chapter 9. So please copy the notes. We are beginning with chapter 9, that is the second last chapter of ICSE syllabus, and that is environment and development, right? So I have not given you many notes because most of the things are very clearly written in the text. Right. So the first topic that we will discuss today from page number 107 is this chapter is environment and development, and the first topic that we'll be discussing is global environmental pollution. A very simple topic which ICSE does ask for, right? You have to be prepared and you have to understand in this particular topic. What we are trying to understand is when we talk of global pollution, who is responsible for global pollution? The developed nations of the world, they are blaming the developing countries. And the developing countries say that it is the fault of the developed countries. So who are we to blame when this question arises? Who is responsible for the global environmental pollution? So let's try to understand what have the developed countries done because of which there is a lot of pollution in the environment. So if we take into account the developed nations of the world, industrialization, early industrialization, where did it begin? It definitely began in the developed nations of the world. And because there was early industrialization, these developed nations, the so-called wealthy nations of the world, what they started doing is they started extracting the resources from the environment. They used up the resources from their own country's environment, and also they claimed the resources of the other poor countries also, because they had so many industries where the raw materials were to be supplied. They extracted all the raw materials from their environment as well as took the raw materials from the developing countries also. So early industrialization began in the developed nations. Too much of use of raw material resources also began with the developed nations. War. When we talk of nuclear war and nuclear weapons, it is the developed nations who can be blamed for starting the World War, for the use of radioactive elements, for nuclear disasters. It is the developed nations who contaminated the entire globe. Okay, and then when it comes to power generation, it is again the developed nations who extract so much of power and they contaminate and pollute the air and the other resources. So when we understand the faults of the developed nations, it becomes very clear that yes, it is the developed nations who are responsible for global environmental pollution. But now when we come to the other side and we think of our own country, India as a developing country, are we also responsible to some extent for this pollution which has contaminated the globe? Let's see the problems of the developing countries. You just think of your own country. So population is very, very high. Developed countries, the population is under control. But for developing nations, the population is very, very high. Okay? And because the population is high, we need to feed this and supply resources to this massive population. So what do the industries in the developing nations like India do? They use, because we are not wealthy, we adopt to using cheap energy resources, all fossil fuels. Especially India is still heavily dependent on coal. And coal, as you all know, badly contaminates not only your country but the entire globe. all carbon dioxide, all the greenhouse gases that are there in the environment today, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, which is responsible for global warming, and acid rain, they are all released from the developing nations because we are using very cheap sources of energy. And the reason we are using cheap sources of energy is because our population is very, very high and we cannot use other means of energy to satisfy this growing population. So we have released all the greenhouse gases, which comes in your examination as GHG, that is greenhouse gases. They are, who's responsible for this? It is the developing nations who are responsible for massive release of greenhouse gases and are also responsible for global warming. Then we have, again, back to population. To feed the population, we have adopted modernization of agriculture. We need to feed these people, the population. So we have modernization of agriculture. What we mean is, now we have given up organic farming that we used to practice long back, because that farming method, the plants grow very slowly. They are very healthy, but they grow slow. So to increase the production, to boost up the production, what have we done is, we are using a lot of chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, intensive irrigation, machineries. All these are being used. That is called modernization of agriculture. And definitely when you have started using chemicals, you are contaminating soil, you are contaminating the underground water bodies, and those contaminated underground water bodies, they contaminate the rivers and then the seas, and then the entire globe is contaminated. Now, what picture comes in our mind? Sometimes we feel the developed are responsible, but when we look at the problems that we have created, being a developing country, it would not be right to blame the developing countries also for global environmental pollution. So what is the answer? Who is responsible for global environmental pollution? The answer is yes, both the developed and the developing are responsible for the state of the environment that we are in today. It is the fault of the developed, it is the fault of the developing also. So what is required today? If you come to the next page on 108, you will see a topic, need for mutual cooperation. There is no need to quarrel and blame each other, but what is the need of the hour is the developed should start helping the developing, and the developing should start cooperating with the developed. If we are to solve this problem of pollution and remove all the wrong activities from the environment, the developed and the developing, they have to mutually cooperate with each other. So we have learned already many examples, class. If you remember, we have done Kyoto Protocol, we have done Montreal Protocol. These are examples of mutual cooperation. How the developed and the developing, they have forgotten the tags of being called developed and developing, and they all come under one roof to decide what action needs to be taken to protect the globe from further damage. Like one example I'll tell you today, Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto, a place in Japan where a meeting was held, more than 174 countries with no tags, no developing and developed tags. All the leaders and signatories from these countries, they came, they met at this place, and what did they decide? They resolved how greenhouse gases can be removed from the environment. This is called mutual cooperation. So there are many such protocols which I will be discussing in the next lecture. For today, you please make it clear who is responsible for global environmental pollution. It is the developed as well as the developing. Thank you, class.